Hey everybody, Who's Your Jedi here with another review for you. And this is a very, very special review. Today I will be reviewing my absolute favorite animated series of all time, and that is none other than Real Ghostbusters. Now I've watched a lot of animated shows from both the West and Japan and all over the place over the years, but to this day, no show holds a greater place in my heart than Real Ghostbusters. We all had our favorite cartoon as a kid. I was a little bit different from a lot of kids of my generation back in the 80s. Everybody that back then, to me at least, it seemed either their favorite show was either G.I. Joe or Transformers. Now, I love me some G.I. Joe. I love Transformers Generation 1. Basically screw anything else in my book. No offense, that's just the school of Transformer fan I come from. But anyway, that said, Real Ghostbusters, for whatever reason, was the show that just really grabbed a hold of me as a kid, and I was just an absolute Real Ghostbusters fanatic. I had the lunchbox when I went to school. I had the toys. I went as a Ghostbuster for Halloween as a kid. I loved this show so much, and I still do. And the reason why is that it's a great show. But I suppose I should get into specifics. Well, one of the strengths of Real Ghostbusters is that it basically came out not too long after the first movie, a few years after the first movie, which, you know, is a great classic 80s film. Now, I guess I should explain why it's called Real Ghostbusters. The short version is there was some legal issues with a previous, not super well known these days movie that was also called Ghostbusters that was made, I guess, back in like the 60s or something. So for legal reasons, and to take a jab at that film and the not so well remembered animated series that it briefly had a spin-off of, they named the show Real Ghostbusters. And to this day, of course, the live-action Ghostbusters movies and this Real Ghostbusters, I don't really have anything to say about Extreme Ghostbusters, are basically what Ghostbusters fans think of. And this show, in a way, it really was, one of the reasons it was so good is because, let me try this again. One of the reasons this show is so fondly remembered by fans is it really was, in terms of writing, so often a cut above the rest of what was going on in terms of animation in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. Now you have to remember, this show came out before people in America really took another look at animation and started considering it as anything more than children. And that basically happened around 1989 when The Simpsons really broke onto the scene. Real Ghostbusters started out a little bit before that. And as such, it was basically forced sort of to play onto the this is for kids playground. But that said, the show did have a lot of very good writers and people who really, and a lot of very talented people working on it in all aspects. And they were able to really, within that format that they were limited to, really go out and not only tell stories that were often extremely funny. I mean, there's some really great comedy on the shows, but to tell stories that were genuinely scary and creepy and and sort of push the envelope that you just didn't really see other shows doing that much in the late 1980s. And that is one of the reasons why so many fans love this show. This is really the only cartoon that I can ever think of from my childhood that, and even to this day really, that genuinely at the time made me feel creeped out or scared. To kind of go with what I'm saying here, there was an episode of the series, very famous one, called The Grundle. And I don't want to spoil that for you if you haven't seen that episode. It is really considered one of the best of the series. But to this day, I have not been able to bring myself to watch that episode again because it just freaked the living hell out of me as a kid. I mean, really, I even today, I still feel slightly creeped out by when I start thinking about some of the stuff that happens in that episode. I mean, that's just how powerful those childhood experiences can be. But that said, as long as I'm continuing along that theme, one of the great things that they did have about this show is, as I said, they did tell some stories that were genuinely very creepy. The Ghostbusters didn't have very many reoccurring nemesises because, just by the nature of what it is they did, at the end of the episode, they would beat the bad guy and the ghost would get, locked away in the containment unit, never to return. But that said, there were a few exceptions to that. And of course, the two who are best known to the fans are the Boogeyman. And the story that they did with him are really very good, very effective stories about the way fear works within us when we're children. Now, of course, when we grow up, as we all know, we're adults. We stop being afraid of, the closet or the little cracks under the, anything under the bed. But that feeling of there being something in the dark that wants to get us and wants to hurt us, even when we're adults, that never quite goes away. And that was really what the stories with about the Boogeyman were about. That, and of course, growing up and having the courage to face our fears. I mean, that was one of the things that I loved best about the stories with the Boogeyman were, and they even explicitly said, if you stop being afraid of him, the Boogeyman can't hurt you. And honestly, even as a kid, I was old enough to have stopped being afraid of things like that, it was still a real joy to go and just see the Ghostbusters take it to the Boogeyman. There was a part where the Boogeyman has the power to travel through closets of children all around the world. And there was this really great scene in the first Boogeyman story where the Ghostbusters are chasing the Boogeyman through all these closets, popping in and out of bedrooms of children around the world. And there's this one scene where the Boogeyman, bursts through this kid's bedroom and jumps into another closet. The Ghostbusters come right after him, and the kid just sees them and he just jumps up on his bed and starts cheering, "Get him, Ghostbusters! Bust him! Bust the Boogeyman!" And I mean, that's just that just really just taps into that feeling you have as a kid of wishing that that the characters you see in your comic books and in your cartoons and those sort of places. I think we all have as kids at some point in our lives wished that our cartoon and comic book heroes could come and chase away our problems in real life. And sadly that can't happen. We are the ones who have to deal with, one way or another, the problems in our lives. But that said, I don't think I'm the only person in the world who over the years has looked back on the stories of that I loved as a kid, the heroes of those stories, and found inspiration and strength. And I know that's a lot to really say about something like real Ghostbusters or all the comic books and superhero stories that I've read over the years, but it's true. And I've been around in fandom long enough to know that I'm not the only person that's true for. I know I've read stories about people who said, when I was having this really hard time in my life, and then I thought about what these characters that I love so much had gone through in their stories, and that gave me comfort and strength, and to get through what it was I was dealing with. And that even then, boy, I've just gone completely off the rails, haven't I? Okay, let's pull it back and talk about my absolute favorite Ghostbusters villain of all, Sam Hain, the spirit of Halloween. Oh, guys. To this day, his and the voice of the Boogeyman, I love them. They still send a little chill down my spine whenever I think about it in my head. And going along with that, this is a series that, as I said, had some absolutely fantastic voice actors working on it. Let's talk about, and I don't want to bore you guys forever with all the details, but I definitely need to hit the highlights of the voices of the Ghostbusters. Now, my absolute favorite Ghostbuster across all incarnations of Ghostbusters is Peter. I love Peter Venkman. I honestly think that I think I look back on him growing up as an inspiration that helped turn me into this rather sarcastic fellow that I am to this day. And Peter was voiced by the late and sorely missed Lorenzo Music. And Lorenzo is a guy who, has a very nice history in television. But aside from Peter, he's actually best known as the guy who did the voice of Garfield for years and years. He was the voice of Garfield. And then, ironically enough, he was replaced by Bill Murray, who, of course, played Peter Venkman in the Ghostbusters movies. And now, to be completely fair, Lorenzo Music was not always the voice of Peter. There were a few times over the years of the series that the voices of the major characters were replaced, and we'll talk about that some more. But after Lorenzo Music left the series, he was replaced by Dave Coulier. And he is best known, of course, as being Uncle Joey on Full House. He was also the host of the show Out of Control, if, like me, you watched Nickelodeon back in the 80s. And if word is true around the internet, also the guy that Alanis Morissette was talking about doing stuff with in a movie theater in the song Ironic. But yeah, let's not dwell on that, shall we? Now, of course, Egon was voiced by the very well-known voice actor Maurice LaMarche. He's a guy who is still all over the place in animation today. He's got a resume a mile long. He actually, I was talked about him several weeks ago when he was doing the voice of Doctor Doom on Ultimate Spider-Man. But apart from Egon, the voice that Maurice LaMarche is probably best known for is the Brain on Pinky and the Brain and Animaniacs. Now, again, if you're from my generation of fans, I don't need to tell you how absolutely awesome the Brain was. He's just one of those absolutely fantastic, wonderful cartoon characters that, to this day, holds an extremely special place in my heart. Moving on. The other Ghostbusters. Winston Zedmore. Now, for the first 3 seasons, he was voiced by none other than Arsenio Hall. Now, again, I have to go back and talk to people of my generation. At the time, Arsenio was an up-and-coming comedian, and he left after 3 seasons as well. But that was mostly because he'd actually become quite famous and would go on to host the Arsenio Hall Show, which for a while in the 90s was one of the hottest talk shows in America. If you've ever seen those old pictures or footage of President Clinton playing the saxophone with sunglasses on TV, he was doing that on the Arsenio Hall Show. That's how big a deal Arsenio was for a while back in the day. Now, and Arsenio did a great job as Winston. If you pay really close attention to those episodes, you can really tell that it's him. After Arsenio left, he was replaced by a fellow by the name of Buster Jones. Now, Buster Jones is a guy who has more than his fair share of really nice acting credits, but he would actually be best known to folks as the voice of Black Vulcan from Super Friends and the fan favorite character Blaster from the original Transformers. Oh yeah. I like so many guys my age. I love Blaster. Blaster was just absolutely awesome. And then, of course, we can't talk about the voice actors on Real Ghostbusters without mentioning Frank Welker, who did the voice of Ray and the voice of Slimer. Now, folks, if you've not heard of Frank Welker, you really do not know your voice actors. This man is literally one of the greatest voice actors in the entire English language. His resume is just absolutely mind-blowing. To put it simply, you would probably best know him as the voice of Freddie Jones from Scooby-Doo. And I mean from every incarnation of Scooby-Doo, except for a pup named Scooby-Doo from the late 80s and early 90s. He's the voice of Freddie Jones. Except for that one show, every time you have seen Fred in Scooby-Doo animation, it's been Frank Welker that's been doing his voice. He was also Marvin on the original Super Friends. And hang on, let me call up some more Frank Welker goodness here. Oh yeah, also a guy with a tremendous resume in terms of Transformers. Let me see here. Oh yes, he was a Transformer that you might have heard of. Went by the name of Megatron. Freaking Megatron! Oh yeah, he was also a guy. My personal favorite Decepticon, Soundwave. Oh God, do I love Soundwave! And he was also Skywarp, Mixmaster, my favorite Constructicon, Laserbeak, Buzzsaw, Rumble, Frenzy, Ravage. He was also Mirage and Trailbreaker from the Autobots. He was also Wheelie in Transformers the movie, but I think we can forgive him for that. And he would later go on to take over from none other than Leonard Nimoy, the voice of Galvatron. And he even came back to Transformers to do the voices of Shockwave, Barricade, and Soundwave in Transformers Dark of the Moon. Wow, that was such a terrible movie. But anyway, getting back to the show. So I think we've established that this show had some very good voice actors working, and that's not to talk about the voices of like Janine and Lewis and some of the guest stars that they had doing voices. I mean, I could go on for a really long time talking about the voice actors on this show. But let's talk a little bit more about the stories. Now, one of the real great strengths of Real Ghostbusters is that they had tremendous flexibility in the amounts of stories they tell. There were some stories that were genuinely just intended to be fun, crazy, adventures, good for a laugh. As I said, there were many episodes that were genuinely honestly scary, definitely for kids, and even as an adult you can go back and still feel a little creeped out by some of this stuff. The writers for this show, which include J. Michael Straczynski, a guy I'm a big fan of. You guys would know him best as the creator of Babylon 5. Well, he worked for a really long time as the head writer on this show. And even after he left the show due to some creative differences, he came back to do freelance work on the show. So the writers on the show really were not afraid to go and really dip into mythology that was out there. They definitely really drew a lot of inspiration more than once from the works of H.P. Lovecraft, a writer who I really love. I mean, Cthulhu himself even popped up in a few episodes of Ghostbusters. And there were more than a few episodes over the course of the series that were very much heavily influenced by the writings of H.P. Lovecraft. And there were other episodes. I remember there was one that really seemed to me a humongous riff on Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. There were, of course, many really great pop culture jokes and references. I know that they had a character one time who was essentially a parody of He-Man. There was Peter talked about Darth Vader one time. And one of the great strengths of the show was that while they were telling these scary stories, while they were telling these funny stories, a lot of the times they would really also tell very good character stories. We would get to see stories that would really give us some very interesting insights into the Ghostbusters' personality. For example, there was an episode that really heavily involved Winston's love of Sherlock Holmes novels. There were stories that involved Ray and the stories from his childhood that came into play during various things that, as a kid looking at these shows, I could relate to, because the Ghostbusters were that to me. There were issues with Egon and Peter having problems with their families. I mean, Peter's dad was sort of a reoccurring character occasionally, and the genuine issues that he had with his father made for some really good stuff that gave Peter some honest depth, that made him really a more fleshed out and 3D character. And even Janine Janine got more than a few episodes that were totally dedicated to, us spending some time with her, getting to understand what was going on with her. And they did an absolutely fantastic episode called Janine, You've Changed that, I can't really talk about that episode without spoiling some really awesome stuff. But trust me, folks, if you want to see a good episode of Real Ghostbusters, go out and find that episode because it is just some really well written, very clever stuff. The people who did that work really came up with some very smart ideas for how they handled things. And speaking of the writers on the show, I was doing some research and I found out that, and excuse me if I don't remember their names off the top of my head, but the creators of the show, Kim Possible, were former writers from Real Ghostbusters. And I haven't actually had the chance to check that show out, but I've heard a lot of really good things about it over the years. So if you're a fan of that, well, this is, I think, a vote in the way of the direction of checking the show out. And yeah, I can't. I wouldn't be. I think it'd be a little remiss if I didn't mention that occasionally the Ghostbusters would also get the chance to go out and travel the world. They did episodes of Ghostbusters with them going to places like Russia, to France, and even to Japan one time. And another thing that I really have to say is that just the sheer creativity of the ghosts and demons and monsters that the Ghostbusters faced over the years is just absolutely incredible. I mean, the Boogeyman, they fought the Headless Horseman, they fought, H.P. Lovecraft critters, they fought like supernatural hitman, they fought. Well, folks, I mean, let me just put it this way. You have to go out and check out the People Busters episode. I really just cannot describe that episode without really just ruining for you. But trust me, that is one that is so worth seeing. Now, anyway, I guess it's only fair that I should talk about some of the downsides, some of the negatives of this show. And I won't lie, there's the occasional episode that just flat out doesn't work. But the real major flaw with Real Ghostbusters is nothing to do with really the writers or the actors. It's basically towards the latter seasons when the executives realized, holy crap, this show's actually doing really in the ratings. Naturally, we should go in there and start dicking with things. And they went in there and basically said, okay, all this stuff about doing stories that are scary needs to stop. We want this is a show for children, so the stories need to be wacky and funny because that's what kids like. And then they also said, well, Slimer's a popular character. Start doing more stuff with him. And it basically retooled the show into Slimer in the Real Ghostbusters, where about half of each episode was focused on Slimer and some rather stupid characters that were created specifically to hang around him. Now, to be perfectly fair, the character of Chili ended up being voiced by Cree Summer, a woman with an extremely impressive voice acting resume. And looking back at it now, it's sort of hilarious to realize that she's essentially using the voice for Chili that she would later go on to use for Foxy Love on Drawn Together. But nonetheless, the later seasons of Real Ghostbusters are definitely not as good as the earlier ones, and that can solely be blamed on the network trying to fix something that wasn't broken in the first place. But folks, with that said, I hope you'll forgive me if this is not quite as in-depth or as serious or as scholarly yeah, me scholarly as my usual reviews. I do apologize for the extreme fanboying I'm doing here, but as I said, to this day, no show, animated show, no cartoon has ever been able to dislodge the special place that this show has in my heart. When I think of loving cartoons as a kid, it is Real Ghostbusters that leaps to my mind. And as you can see, to this day, just talking about it gets me so excited, so pumped, because I love this show so much. it's really a show where I really got the chance as a kid to see just what they really could do, the real possibilities in animation. Now, we are very fortunate to live in a time where we're seeing shows from both America and from Canada and from Japan and from all over the world that are going out and telling these stories that, of course there's stuff that's out there, plenty of it, that's meant for kids, but there's also plenty of animation that's out there for adults. There's plenty of animation out there that can be enjoyed by people of all ages. And I like to consider Real Ghostbusters kind of a herald for the really wonderful age of animation that we are fortunate enough to enjoy now. While it's certainly not without its flaws, it really was a pioneer in treating kids as intelligent viewers, and in writing kid shows that could not just be enjoyed by children, but could be enjoyed by their parents and by those kids when they came back later in life and could recognize references to things like H.P. Lovecraft and all these other things that would completely go over their heads as kids. So with that said, folks, if you are looking for a good old school animated show, if you're wanting something that's got some real atmosphere to it, that's got some intelligent writing, and is still entertaining and fun, then I urge you, please give a few episodes of this show a try. It is genuinely some really great animation, and I think you'll be pleased with it. So with that said, folks, as always, please comment, rate, and subscribe. You can, of course, follow me on Twitter at HoosierJedi. And until next time, take care and have a good one.